Hello, hello. We are live, and it's a Monday. This weekend beat me up a lot. I've got scratches, scrapes, burns everywhere. There was a water slide, and it definitely beat me up a bit. It was pretty fun, but definitely learned my lesson. Hopefully all of you had a good weekend as well. Starting off Monday on a good note. You know, this is my last week at my corporate job, so it's a transition for me. This will be a fun week of lives. So let's see if we can get Ross on here. Trying to adjust my computer so that it's actually facing the right direction. Hello. There.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
I think I'm in the frame now. I think I should be good. There we go.
I'm having to adjust. Now you're seeing my room. There we go.
Awesome. How are you doing today?
Hey, good. It is still technically Pride Month, and when you work for an LGBTQ organization, Pride is a lot of work, so I may have tried to take 2 naps today so far. And I'm still doing a panel or a workshop or a thing. So my day job is a lot of LGBTQ organizational stuff. So it is full, and the rest is coming this coming weekend.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a packed month for me as well. And I mean, it was bad because I felt like everyone planned everything on the same weekend around me, and I had to choose, and I don't like choosing. I wish I could just do it all. And so I had to pick and choose which Pride events I actually participated in.
I've been still a little wary of crowds and indoors and things. So half this weekend was still at home, and I am an extrovert, but I have found me becoming much more of a homebody and oh, we could just be here. Oh, we should go out and do something. But so we kind of half were at home, and then sort of said, okay, no, we should go do things, and met up with friends and ended up in, good places. So it worked, but it took a bit of, unlearning the last year and a half to have the energy to do it.
Yeah, I definitely cut down on the crowd type Pride stuff that I celebrated this year. Hopefully 2022 will be the year I get to go back out and do crowd stuff. But for now, I kind of did stuff that was more small type stuff around Richmond and then with my friends that are a part of the community.
Nice. Yeah, I was mostly with friends too. I was like, okay, if I'm not going to go just stand among strangers, I'll at least go around people I know.
It's a little bit safer. Awesome. Well, I will let you go ahead and introduce yourself so people know who you are, and then we can jump into a discussion.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ross Murray. I am the founder and director of the Naming Project, which is an LGBTQ church camp for teenagers. I am a senior director at GLAAD, working with the GLAAD Media Institute, and I wrote a book called Made Known Love, Developing LGBTQ Inclusive Youth Ministry, which mostly comes from my experience at the Naming Project and working with young LGBTQ people on things like identity development, faith development, safe, caring, faithful community, building things like that. And so my world of youth ministry and advocacy are kind of weird and sort of cross over each other. And then I also am producing a podcast called Yes Jesus with Azariah Southworth and Daniel Francesi, which has been very fun to do. It is humorous, it is Christian and faithful, but I also get to make a lot of off-color jokes, which is really fun.
Yeah, I'm friends with Danny, and I've listened in on that podcast a couple times, so I've really enjoyed that.
I nudge my husband every so often. There's some particular joke, I'll nudge and be like, I wrote that one, just so he knows. Nobody else has to.
I love it. And I think that that's amazing because for me personally, I always tell people when it comes to my coming out story, my faith played a huge role in that. And as I connect more with LGBT people in the community and finding more and more people that also have held on to their faith and their religion, it's very interesting because I think the interesting thing about our community is it's not like a lot of other communities in the world, because when it comes to LGBT, a lot of us start off on our own. So when it comes to creating our path, we don't usually have a lot of people beside us in the beginning. So when we do come together and when we do like find that journey of self-acceptance and learning to accept ourselves in the world, it's always very, very different. And I've met lots of people who still consider themselves Christian in our community, but our way of learning to accept that is like so different. And it's so interesting to kind of communicate that with people, because I've just learned to accept everyone's journey, but there are still some people out there that when we come in contact, it's really hard for people to kind of understand each other's perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, partly because one of the things about religion and about faith is that is about identity development. It is answering questions about who we are and, why are we here and what are we going to do? And we get stories that talk about who we are and why we're here. We get rituals that remind us and make us do like tactile things to live that out. And I think that's so important to figuring out who we are. And then, if you're in a community where that gets taken away from you or says, oh, this part of your identity can't be who you are. Sorry, background noise here. There's more than one of us in this room, and now one of us is walking out. So real live folks here. So having that taken away means you do have to like figure out how to reconnect with those identity questions and stories, and you're still telling yourself you are. And I think I sort of said before that even if people are reacting to the religion they were raised in, it is still an influence on their life. Like they may not be part of the community, they may not believe it anymore, but that still kind of makes a little bit who they are. And I find that really interesting, which is why I always ask, like, how are you raised? How do you identify now? And try to figure that out for folks.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to those types of things, it's a journey no matter what. And I do agree with you. Like, even if you're reacting to it versus like being a part of the community, it still has an impact on who you're becoming. And I've always tried to find the love and the positive and the kindness of the whole journey. But there are definitely some people who have a very strong opinion against when it comes to religion, and not so much spirituality. I think that those two things are kind of looked at a little differently by the community. So it's always very interesting to kind of meet people who say that they're still spiritual. They just don't like organized religion. And it's very interesting to kind of see like some of the anger between the two, because for me, the longest time I was told by both communities I couldn't be both. So it was like an internal battle for me to figure out how those two could live together. Because whenever I tried to remove one or the other, I still felt like something wasn't right and something was missing. And I think that it took kind of letting go of my connection with the organized religion to find love and acceptance for myself, and then coming back around and figuring out how I could do that. Because when I wasn't confident and loving of myself when it came to being gay, I couldn't be in a church, at least none of the ones that I was participating in, and be confident and feel loved. Everything felt like a knife stab when I was there. So I had to kind of pull myself out, grow confidence in my identity, and then put myself back in and realize that my identity didn't require their permission, which was actually a huge breakthrough for me when it came to that, because then I felt like I could still connect with my faith and not like feel horrible about it every single time.
Yeah. I think I think that's huge, and I think part of it is we have to figure out who we are, and we have to figure out our own faith, our own spirituality. And when people talk about organized religion, I guess my take on it, and I'm a part of organized religion. I'm a Lutheran deacon. I'm like rostered, and so I sort of talk about there is God, and there's the God who created the world and you and redeemed you and loves you and gives you his ongoing power. And then there's the institution. And the institution is very much a human construct, and humans are foible and prone to error and sin and don't get things right all the time. And we're people that are trying, but we build an institution. And so then maybe that's, and that's where some of that shortcoming is, which means we don't let the institution define who we are or even define our relationship with God. The institution is supposed to be there to help with that process and to give you the community and to give you the ritual and to give you the, some focus and some language for that. But there's a lot of ways in which that will fall short. And so even for someone who does have a good relationship with their church or with their community, I still highly encourage to figure out what your own relationship is and what it looks like before, you just 100% identify with what the institution is, because humans will always let you down. And knowing that, some people don't like that, but I find that really freeing. It means my expectations are managed. When people do great things, then I get to be pleasantly surprised. And I'm very aware of kind of the brokenness of the world, and I can still live in that because I'm a part of that.
Yeah, I think that once I learned that as well, I kind of stopped, because I think that I would always pour so much out into the world and I would expect it to come back. And then once I realized that you have to pour and that be the good, and you gain all the love and respect by pouring it out, not by receiving it back. Because unfortunately, who you pour into doesn't necessarily pour back into you later. I always learn that it's other places and people that do that. And just kind of learning that process was really helpful for me, because I learned that there was a lot of people that I could teach, and they weren't going to be my teachers. There was going to be someone else out there that was going to be my teacher when it came to that type of stuff.
Right. There's always a investment in people, and sometimes you get a good return on the investment, and sometimes you don't. And sometimes you get the surprises that come back to you at places where you never would have expected it. And I think that is also the beauty of humanity. Again, I sort of stressed her the expectation of getting let down, but then there's always the surprises of where you are being buoyed and where you are being lifted up, and where where you're clicking and connecting with people, and you are doing, and vocationally you're doing the exact right thing at the exact right time that's needed.
Yeah, I think that just kind of looking at your book, I still haven't had a chance to read it because I just did this whole transition of moving, but when it comes to children, I think that is such an important focus, especially myself growing up in a very Christian household and being very involved in the religion growing up, and kind of hearing what was said and done about the LGBT community. And then also now as an adult, trying to go out there and kind of open myself up and being extremely vulnerable for churches to just ask me questions. It's very interesting. And I even did a YouTube video where I talked about why I thought organized religion and stuff like that was dangerous to the LGBT community, because a lot of times I speak to them and they think what they are saying is love, because they believe that leading you to God's path is going to be the best answer. And some of the words that they use, and you and I kind of talked about how I had done a live with someone who also wanted to be a person that brought LGBT people to the church. But a lot of the verbiage that was used definitely didn't feel like they were interested in bringing people to the church. And I think that that's something that a lot of people within the church don't understand when it comes to their verbiage and how they speak to LGBT people, because even I have been to churches where I'm just I'm not sure I would ever bring young LGBT people here, because this would instantly trigger a lot of people in the LGBT community. And it's just interesting to kind of hear how the organized religion, when those people speak, how they're confused by how that verbiage could be so harmful to our community.
Well, and I think the reality is that they've been, for so long, LGBTQ issues in the church have been they're very adult oriented. They're kind of oh, we're still grappling, we're struggling, let's do a study. And it's often asking questions that are adult in nature. When I used to do LGBTQ advocacy in the Lutheran Church, the big thing that we worked on was ordination, right? Like becoming clergy. And then after that, marriage, right? And like what role do churches have in marriage? Those are both really like adult issues. Those are not about identity formation. Those aren't about, you know, who did God make me to be? Am I going to be accepted by my peers? Am I going to get through 10th grade without getting beat up, right? And so there's a whole different set of issues that are youth oriented that are not the same things that our churches have talked about. And I think especially with youth ministry, one of the nuances there is to think through that. Like, this is not a debate. This is a young person that's in front of you. What are you going to do or say to make sure that they know and understand that God created them and knows them and loves them? And in answering those type of questions, which is very different than a debate or a discussion. And I say this in my book, but like, my book is not an argument for inclusion. I'm not trying to make the case. I'm just assuming people already want to do that. And this is a little bit like how to do that. And recognizing that youth are going to be really different than what adults are. Their experience with the world, the questions they have are going to come out really differently. And the LGBTQ angle is going to have to say like, oh, there's ways I want to rethink how I talk about this because it's an LGBTQ young person. And it can actually make us examine how we do our youth ministry, which could make our youth ministry be better for all young people, because a lot of those assumptions that we've had for a long time maybe aren't serving us so well anymore, and can have you say, oh, this isn't just good for LGBTQ kids. This is kids who don't want to date, or who, you know, or don't fit into whatever the gender roles have been assigned to them, or their relationship with their parents, or sexism, or any of that, I think can also get addressed as we kind of do that examination.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the way things are taught, it's definitely very standard to the most very specific, most privileged way of explaining the way families should function, the way that mommy and daddy has kids, and all of that type of stuff, where when you do have kids being raised by their grandparents, when you do have like all the different diversities of the world, I think that it definitely pays off to make your ministry as wide-reaching as possible, because I definitely have spoken to people of lots of different minority groups where they feel very excluded when it comes to ministries, just because, I mean, and also when it comes to the Bible stories and making things very, very white. I think that that is a thing that I've talked to a lot of people about, and I was just like, yeah, it has kind of been whitewashed, especially when it comes to the things that we show our children. I've seen a lot of, when it comes to the little cartoons and all the little books that are created for children to kind of show them, because I've been buying a lot of stuff for my nephew so that I could share that with him on a level that he would understand. And now that I've been made more aware of that whiteness and whitewashing, I've noticed that a lot of that is very, very prevalent in the religious stuff for kids.
Yep. And the Bible is a story about people living in the Middle East, and should reflect that, and should do the reality of that. And I think that's one of those things. The Bible is filled with queer people and queer stories that we also have not recognized, because I mean, something happens, I think, where we sort of conflate, and you know, Christian history for a long time has been, we conflate our own life and experience and sort of project that onto the story. And for a long time, the ones who get to control it are, you know, straight white men from Europe, and getting to share that. And again, I am white, I am gay, I'm white, I'm male, so like I still have so much of that privilege. But as you start to like look and actually examine the stories, you do start to see this relatability and start to uncover and understand where queer people show up and what stories might be relatable to us or to a young person that's never been talked about, because no one's looked at it with that lens for such a long time. And I've been fascinated. I've been reading more articles. The biblical literacy of folks that that claim to be biblical literates tend to know most of their Bible stories through things like VeggieTales. And so being told these stories by a tomato and a cucumber, and again, which makes editorial choices about how it's going to be presented. And so we can start to look at, what are these stories and what do they do and what do they look like? And maybe we create our own little recreation of queer Bible stories. That's our camp theme for this year, is queer Bible stories. And we're just going to take out a few of those and talk about them and examine them. My favorite one, I will share this with you if you want. So Joseph of Genesis, Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. At the very beginning, he's the youngest of 12 brothers, and his dad gives him this garment. And the Hebrew word for it, which I don't know Hebrew well, so I'm probably mispronouncing it, is ketnet pasim. And what is a ketnet pasim? So we've translated a coat of many colors, the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? We have all these images of what this looks like. That word only appears one other place in the Hebrew scripture. And one of the ways that we learn what words mean is how they get used and in what context. And in my translation, it actually says that he was given a robe with long sleeves. That's how it's described. Not even, but the word appears somewhere else. And it says, Tamar, the daughter of King David, was wearing a robe with long sleeves because that is what the virgin daughters of the king wore. And so this word shows up that could be called a princess dress, because that is what she is and what she's wearing, and like explain this is why she's wearing it. So does this entire story about older brothers not liking Joseph so much because he has this garment that is gender non-conforming and maybe brings some ridicule upon him and the family, and that causes a reaction, not just I'm jealous because you're my dad's favorite, but oh my goodness, there's my little brother with his dress showing up in the field, and what if people see us like this, right? That is a totally different version of the story that people can see and understand and relate to. But for years, we've insisted on calling it a coat in Genesis so that we can imagine him wearing a pea coat or something like that, something that does look more masculine. But maybe he wasn't, and that can be part of that story. And even years later, when Joseph is people know the Bible, fast forward a long ways, Joseph ends up managing grain for Egypt enough that his own brothers have to come and beg for food. His brothers don't recognize him. And I keep thinking of how many of us have grown up and gone away where people that knew us as children don't recognize us anymore, because now we are adults. We're actually living into ourselves. We're expressing ourselves, our gender expression, in a way that more matches who we are, not the way our parents were dressing us. And they can't recognize us because so much has changed in the world. That's pretty relatable too. It's relatable to not be recognized because you actually are now more yourself than you ever were when you were back home. And that can make a character like Joseph so relatable to queer folks, but we've never talked about it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely love that whole idea, just because I always tell people, because a lot of arguments that I have with people is about history when it comes to what is written and what is known of a time. And I always tell people, I was like, it's not like minority groups had an option to, or could afford to, write and preserve their own history. The people in power, the people with money, were the ones that got to claim whatever part of history they wanted to represent their time. And I think that it's important for people to realize that, I mean, queer people have existed forever. We didn't just pop up in the 21st century just because we finally could. We've existed forever, and there are so many stories that were never preserved and never told. And even when, you think about it, there are probably our grandparents' time where there were people who were queer that they knew they were queer, but once that person passed away, that story was erased because they were embarrassed by it or didn't want people to know. So therefore, there's a lot of people that are starting to find historical photos that were taken and sharing it, but there's still a lot that maybe was burnt or not shared because people had shame around queer individuals in their family line. And I think that it's kind of cool to even think about the Bible, when it comes to, like you said, uh, humans can imperfect anything. So therefore, even because I did research around like the history of the Bible and how it was pieced together, and it was there were pieces that were left out and excluded because it didn't fit into what they were trying to get the Bible to represent at that time. And I think that
Right.
it's important for people to realize that, like, maybe some queer eyes need to take a look at some things and decipher it instead of having it deciphered by one group of people and then accepted as the 100% honest truth.
Yep. And I want to also stress that does not take away the sacredness of the text. It does not take away the truth and the truths that exist within the Bible. It doesn't, like, again, it was written down by humans, compiled by committee, translations abound. And that means that there's these discrepancies, there's these contradictions, there's these things that butt up against each other. And it's still a great divine document. In fact, the invitation then is not to abandon it, but actually just dive further into it and live into those weird contradictions or those crazy stories. And I love telling stories and like, I didn't know that was in there, because you realize, I'll tell you one of my other favorite ones that I talk about, and I learned this in college. If you're familiar with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and people bring that up, and it's one of the arguments. So do you know that there's another telling of that same story that shows up later in Judges, but it is freakier and weirder than the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and actually might tell us more about what's going on in the story than what shows up in the Genesis version. You have this traveler that is traveling with his concubine and ends up in a town and gets accepted into a home, and all the men of the village want to come out and want to attack and want to rape him, and he shoves his concubine out the door, and they rape her to death. And when he finds her dead, he cuts her body up into 12 parts and mails each of the 12 to the different tribes of Israel, just to say, look what happened. And then all the tribes say, well, this offending tribe did this. We're not going to let any of our daughters marry any of them. But then they thought, but then that would mean they would go extinct. But we pledged that we wouldn't give our daughters in marriage. So what we're going to do is hold a festival where all the girls dance, and these guys can come in and just kidnap girls while they're dancing, which means we didn't give them our daughters, but they got them anyway. That is like the bigger, fuller retelling of this same story that gets used against one section of the community. It actually shows how toxic the patriarchy and an arranged marriage and heterosexuality just is in general. And so anytime someone bring up Sodom and Gomorrah, I like drive them immediately to this Judge's story to say, like, you have to read this one and then tell me what it says about you and your life before you try to tell me what a scripture verse would say about my life.
Yeah. I mean, I really dove into the Bible because what I was being told by the churches didn't fit what I felt was correct for me as a person. So I think that that's one of the nice things about the LGBT community is we, from a younger age, just feel like what is structure, what is considered order and correct just doesn't fit our story. And so therefore we have to dive into things and understand them at a deeper level than some. Of course, there are going to be some that just reject it altogether or reject things that just don't fit. I've learned that doesn't work well for me, rejecting things around me that exist because they exist within the same world I exist in. So I have to understand and figure out why it's not working. But there's so many things in the Bible that they're not spoken about in the church, and there's just certain parts, and no matter how many times you cycle through the Bible, they use the same parts over and over again, but leave out a lot of the meat that you can read on your own, which I think is important for people to do. And I also in college took a class where we went through all the different religious scriptures and read them as more of fiction than actual like facts. And we just interpreted it that way, as well as looking at the historical context around each of them. And it was a very, very interesting way to kind of read all the different scriptures without, because even within that class, we had people who were very, very religious that they were okay with taking all the other religions apart and talking about them as if they were fantasy. But as soon as we got to Christianity, it was very, very hard for them to hear them speak about people within the Bible as if they were just made up characters. And for me, that kind of opened my eyes to interpreting things in my own way and reading it in different ways to where I gained more perspective. And it's very interesting to kind of look at it that way. And I think that as queer people who are interested in like holding on to their religion, which I think is important, because I almost feel like a lot of people are raised in it and then they rip it out of them because the queer community is also very condemning when you hold your religious beliefs out there for the world to see. Because I've been attacked by just as many people in the LGBT community for wearing a cross as I have been when it comes to the Christian community being upset that I am not going to be ashamed of being part of the LGBT community.
Right. Yeah, I try to always put both of those things out there together to make sure people know it's a part of my life, part of my identity, and to not apologize for either one, to recognize that I'm a complex person, a lot of different stuff going on, and these are both part of what make me me. And I don't think about them anymore in terms of being conflict with each other. It just that's what I am, and so describe that. And I think people are a little scared that I'm, if I share I'm Christian, they're scared I'm going to like proselytize or something, and that is. Usually by the time I share that, they know me well enough to sort of know that's not my style. I'm pretty front of saying this is who I am, this is what I believe. Am I concerned with what somebody else believes? Not really. That is going to be their life and that's going to be their journey. And so someone has to really intentionally go out of their way to sort of be upset that I'm going to believe something that's different than them, which, folks can do it, but it's kind of a waste of their time and energy and attention when I don't like, I don't want to say don't care, but kind of don't, like, I'm going to let them be on whatever their own particular journey is. And if they've got questions or thoughts or comments, I'm kind of always there for follow-up, and I'll talk and explain things at least as I see them and understand them. And, if that's helpful for them, great. If it's not, then it wasn't meant to be that I was going to be the one, I'm not going to give anyone faith. They've all got that for themselves, and part of that is their own personal journey.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people reach out to me in my private messages and ask me how I'm both. And I always tell them, like, we are complex people. Like, I'm more than just my sexuality and my religious beliefs as well. And I always tell them, I'm like, what if you were looking at a cat sitting on the floor and someone told you that it can't be a cat and orange at the same time? Like, it can't be an orange cat. Like, it has to pick one or the other. Can't be both. And I was like, that's exactly like someone telling me that I can't be a gay Christian. I'm like, I'm sorry, but I am. So therefore, your argument that I can't be is invalid because I am. I exist right here just as much as anything else. So when it comes to that argument, it's just an invalid argument.
And I think for both people, I mean, they're imbuing a lot of this with their stereotypes of what they think both being gay and being Christian are like. And one of the things I like to do is break down those stereotypes as much as possible. And so, have them and so they'll say like, oh, but you're irreverent, you swear. Like, it's just stuff like that. And helping people sort of recognize, like, whatever taught you that is what a Christian is supposed to be. The same thing of like whoever taught you that what like the right kind of gay or the right kind of queer is. None of those are true or accurate or 100% a match for any of us, which is helpful to remind people that we are, we're complex people and we've got a lot of different things that are going on in our life. And sometimes something's more important at one point and sometimes something's more than others. And I think why I like youth ministry, I want young people to figure this out while they're in the first adolescence, instead of having to go back through it and unlearn a bunch of stuff and then figure out how to live in the world. If they can figure that out when they're 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, adolescence is already hard and messy and gross enough. Like, do all the things at once as opposed to having to like make a second wave with it. And I think that's partly to wrestle with all of those. What are the stereotypes? Who am I? How much do I fit a stereotype? How much do I, embody the things that are supposed to be, and what's essential to being part of this identity and what's really not? I think that's and what does it mean to be a part of a larger community? All those things are great things to be figuring out when you're young, so then you can actually live into them when you're older.
Yeah, I always tell people that when it comes to the LGBT community, especially if they're coming out at a later age, like, you're having to unlearn yourself to relearn, because a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of us understanding who we are is starting to develop when we're teenagers. And if most of that time is spent grabbing onto things to hide who you are from the world, then you have to, at some point, figure out, okay, what parts are me and which parts are just the part I grabbed hold to hide my true identity. And that can be a really confusing time. And I think that it's really important for people to learn who they are in the most authentic way at an earlier stage, because it's almost interesting to look at the LGBT community and relationships when it comes to the relationships of heterosexual people in the teenage community and then relationships in the LGBT community, because it's almost like some of the things that we could have learned here were never learned. And then we have to learn them at an adult stage where we actually have more ability to make greater mistakes that could really
and consequences.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting to kind of look at that, because I read The Velvet Rage. I'm sure you've heard of that book. That one, because I thought that I was a pretty well-developed person. I was like, you know what? I'm an adult. I think that I have understood myself pretty well. I think that I've unpacked a lot of the trauma that I had accumulated over the years of pretending to be someone I wasn't. But then when I started reading that book, I realized that there were still a lot of things ingrained into who I was out of fear of being discovered by the world for being who I really wanted to be. And I think that helped me unpack even more. But that trauma is so important to unpack. And I think that a lot of times, like you were saying with communities, there's stereotypes. I had to get a dry erase marker and just erase all the things that were under the checklist for what it meant to be gay, what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to be a good person in general. And I had to kind of wipe it all clean and just be like, okay, who I am is all of this. So who am I, despite all the lists that people are giving me of what they think it should be? And I was just like, okay, let's start over. And it really did. There were definitely a lot of times where people would say things and I had to realize that it was a trigger based upon something that was still not healed in me, and take that and figure out where it came from and heal it somewhere so that I could be more myself and be able to go out and be more of a loving person that I believe God wants me to be in the world. Help more people find that self that doesn't need all those lists down underneath all the things that they are.
Right. Yeah, it's so tempting to want other people to tell us who we are, and we just we can't do that. There are guides, there are helpful things, and we sort of do this. We sort of do this with the Naming Project too. Our adult leaders, I have a lot of conversations with them up front of, one, I have to tell the adult leaders, this camp is not for you, it is for the young people. And so if something comes up that you need to process, do not do that with the young people. You need to go find me or another leader and go off and deal with it, so that you're in a good place to do that for yourself. And the other rule that we have about young people is when young people tell us something about themselves, we believe them and we treat them accordingly, and until they tell us something different that will contradict that, right? And so when someone, if someone doesn't yet know what their sexual orientation or their gender identity is, they might try on some different things. Like, is this the thing that fits? Okay, we'll talk, and I'll respect that. But later you might be like, that wasn't actually the right fit. I'm really this thing over here. Okay, and then we'll just adjust and go to that new thing, giving folks the freedom, as opposed to being like, well, you latched onto this one thing, and now here's all the list of assumptions of things that go with that. Helping them to think through that can be really powerful and really helpful. So our adults are kind of this non-anxious presence that can listen, that can reflect, that can ask hopefully clarifying questions to help young people know for themselves and be able to articulate better their faith, their beliefs, their identity, their all that. And so and then putting a bit of a structure around that. And I think that's what's been really important and powerful and helpful. And then I try to get, the Naming Project has maybe 6 or 8 counselors in a given summer. And I try to get a range of folks. So there's always different types of people to be relating to, right? Different folks to learn from. And that's to make sure there are always these kind of role models or possibility models of what relationship, what queer people look like as grown-up adults walking around the world, and trying to be relatively well-adjusted, while also explaining that we are all still have foibles and sin and fall short of the glory of God, and to talk and own that a little bit for ourselves as well.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, when it came to church camp and growing up, like, there was one person in a camp that really helped me kind of understand something that had happened to me as a kid. Whereas, like, for the longest time, like, I met this person at the age of almost 18. It was the summer right before I turned 18. And up until that point, like, I clung on to being molested as a child as my sin, as something that I'd done wrong. And that was something that I clung on to. And I also thought it was the reason why I had gay thoughts versus being straight like other people. And of course, when I came out to this person, they were helpful to the fact that I had been molested and wanted to be helpful in that way, but they were very much pushing me away from my queer identity, which was a thing that I had to overcome later in life. But it was kind of interesting to kind of have an adult tell their story in a way that finally I felt like there was someone else like me, because stuff like that, when it happens to kids, they don't know, or at least at my time. I think that more and more kids now, with internet and YouTube and YouTubers sharing their stories, like, you find role models a little bit easier. But for me, like, from the age of 5 to 17, like, I was alone in that journey and had to deal and process with it, what I was hearing from the world around me. And I always tell people, when it comes to the queer journey, like, there's a lot of stuff that we hear that we're not 100% sure. And, like, I really loved, like, the Prayers for Bobby movie when that one came out, because the statement where she said, like, they're listening, like, before you preach hate, like, before, like, that comes out of your mouth, be aware that kids are listening, and you don't know what their, like, past has given them. So when your words come out, like, you have to be careful. And, like, for me, I try to make sure that I don't come across judgmental in any way, because we are naturally going to judge situations and judge things that we see. But I always tell people, like, you don't know what someone's journey is. So you have to be really careful, because you can literally flick that switch and turn someone off from ever wanting to talk to you, from ever wanting to be a part of the church. And a lot of adults don't understand that sometimes as a kid, like, all it takes is one adult to completely end that line of communication with someone.
Right. Yeah. I think, and the hard thing for adults, I think, is that we filter and, like everyone, we're filtering and processing everything through our lives and through our experiences, which means and this is, again, I talk about this to the leaders, like, I'm trying to not have you just transfer your trauma onto young people, or expect that they're going to face the same things that you do. And I think one thing I've realized as a 40-something-year-old guy now, to recognize the issues young people are facing today are not the same issues that I faced in high school. And I still carry a lot of that with me, what my issues were in high school. And at the same time, recognize they're not in the same place that I am. They don't have the same hangups that I do. And so I have to sort of be open to them, not struggling with the things that I struggle with, but actually struggling with new or different things that I didn't even know were going to be an issue or a problem or something for people's lives. And I think it's always so important for adults that are working with young people to remember that the world has changed and things are in such a different place than where they were. And I in some way you can think of it as progress. But every time there's progress, it sort of unroots what the new problems are. And so I don't want to invalidate and say, young people don't have any problems. There are issues that they face, but they've solved some of the ones that I had, but they've also unearthed a bunch of new stuff that we have to figure out, for them and for themselves, which is a whole new challenge. And mostly that work's going to be on them. And we're just kind of there to try to help.
Yeah. I always tell people that when it comes to when I was younger and trying to uncover myself, I felt like there wasn't enough information for me to identify myself. And today's youth, it almost seems like they are bombarded by so much information that they don't have to search for it. They have to weed through it because, when it comes to the information that exists on the internet, it's a lot. And you aren't only getting it from the perspective of people around you that understand all the different things that exist within your social norms. You're getting it from people who don't understand you at all and are trying to share their opinion that might not match up with anything that you can identify with because you didn't grow up in that situation. And so it's definitely an interesting thing. But I've learned just from unpacking myself is questions are the best way for adults to talk to younger kids. And you have to learn to form questions that are unbiased questions, because you can ask a question that makes that
that's a statement with a question mark at the end.
Yeah, it's just you can ask the question in a way that it's if you answer this way, I'm going to judge you. We both know what the right answer to this question is. Or you can ask the question where it's completely open and saying I want to hear your honest answer, and you won't be judged no matter what you answer. And that takes a lot of practice, because even I have had to kind of practice it when it comes to my relationships with people that are closer to me, because I think that I know them when it's only my perspective of what I see and hear of them. And it's so important, because even when you ask people questions, you want to be able to allow them to answer truthfully, because even if they sense a hint of judgment from your question, or if you've ever in your past made it feel like you're going to judge them, it kind of blocks you off from ever getting that deeper connection with a child or people in your life.
Right. It's a little bit the distinction between and I think with this, do you want to be right, or do you want to be useful or helpful in the world? And those two things might be really different. And so the judginess sort of comes in of I'm prepared to correct you when you're wrong, as opposed to I'm trying to learn more about you. And learning more about you is where we really need to be, partly, and especially for young people. So the other thing I really stress is that none of us are born knowing any of this stuff. Like you said, when we were young, there wasn't information, and we didn't have resources or thoughts or words about how we were feeling or any of that. And now there's this kind of wealth of information, but people still have to figure out what actually is the match for them. And so I think this is why we have an expanding lexicon of sexual orientations and gender identities, because the more that is out there, people say, oh, this is more exactly what I am. I don't want to use big overarching general labels like homosexual or even gay, and I use gay for myself, but to recognize that no, the way I actually am feeling is, and if that word doesn't exist, we'll make up a word to describe how we feel, and we'll give it that definition. And that's the evolution of language. It's also the evolution of knowing and understanding ourselves and not wanting to be labeled by others but actually take labels on for ourselves that we really do think reflect the reality of who we are and how we live and move and relate to people in the world.
Yeah. I don't know if you're on the Clubhouse app yet, but I was in a Clubhouse room and someone was speaking how uh, they identify as queer right now because no other word fits what they feel they are. And
Mm-hmm.
they said until they feel like another word defines them better, that they're going to identify with the broader term of queer just because they don't, like when you look at the LGBT, all the letters,
Yeah.
they didn't identify with any of those specific ones. And I think that it is important for people to realize that now that we're creating a more accepting space, a more validating space for people, like that language is being created because people feel
Yeah.
safe enough to use it. And I think that that's one of the things that, like, when it comes to religion, it has been so structured and so strict for so long that when it comes to the communities now that are feeling safer to explore things that aren't within the walls that are currently up, like, it's almost like people are finding ways to kind of exist on the outside of the walls that were there. Some of them might be still sticking close to it for the safety, or because that's what they know that they are. They just don't feel like they're fitting into that box that some people have created in the past. And
Right.
it's important to kind of say, like, well, back then, the white, straight male was the one who set that box up for us. And that means that now we're okay with exploring what's
Mm-hmm.
outside of that. And it was funny because last year was pretty intense. Like, everyone's year was kind of flipped upside down from what they thought was going to happen. And it was interesting to see my queer family, my other like friends and family that existed within other groups that didn't fit the standard or the norm, deal with a pandemic that got rid of all the norm for everyone. And we were quicker to accept it, whereas people who were very, very accepted for fitting into that box that existed, like
That's
having their box explode on them, stunned them for a really long time. And it was very interesting to watch how people who have had to explore outside of the box because they didn't feel like they fit in, uh, saw the pandemic and they're like, okay, what do we have to do to make this work? How can we adjust to make this more stable for us as quickly as we can? Whereas
right.
others sat there stunned and they're like, it'll turn back to normal soon. It'll turn back to normal soon. And then they had to learn how to explore chaos
Yep.
for the first time because the world wasn't returning to any type of normal very quickly,
Yep.
and they had to explore that.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, the whole conversation about returning to normal, and I think even early on, there were some folks like that, and I thought about this, like, there's so much stuff I don't want to go back to. There's so many things that now that we're not doing, I'm kind of okay that they never get picked up again. And what's funny for people that kind of have this nostalgia for like, oh, we could just go back to, I kind of want to ask, like, what is it exactly you want to be able to go back to? Like, let's name the specific things. Because, like, do I want to go out with friends in a group, in a crowd, inside, and not feel freaked out? That would be great. And I am definitely not there yet. But like, you know what? I've been way better about, I wash my hands when I come inside. I realize that when I'm sick, I'm going to take a day off instead of coming into the office to spread it all over to everybody else. Like, these are things that I would just kind of do and push myself through before. And doing that sort of examination is helpful. Even things like, I had a really good kind of built a structure for myself when I talk to my family, my loved ones, that was sort of irregular before, and then realizing, like, oh, during the pandemic, it can be a much more regular thing. It can be, we structured our days of like, we're going to go take walks outside 3 times a day. We're scheduling this to do. I want to keep that going as we change and return to something. Whereas a return to normal, when you've got a big commute in the middle of your day, that may not be possible. Like, what are the things that I can do to actually, that made me healthier this year? Despite the fact that I was trying to hide from a pandemic, but actually can come out of it a better, more fit, more healthy person, which is really interesting to hear.
Yeah, my company that I was working for, that I'm like leaving, they had like mental health days where like that was the focus of like making sure all of our employees were still in a good headspace. And even I stopped posting so much on my Facebook, where I felt like a lot of people, instead of talking to me, they would just look at my Facebook for an update, which cuts all communication back and forth. And
Yep.
because I still had a commute back and forth to work, an hour to work and an hour back, I started using that time to actually phone call people that were important in my life. And that type of connection, and of course, these positive talks came out of that as well, because I started having those deeper conversations with people I really cared about. And I was like, this needs to happen more. This needs to not end
Right.
when we're face to face. And even like now, I've noticed, now that I'm hanging out with my friends more than I was during the pandemic, I've noticed that none of us really pick up our phones when we're around each other, because we're just like so fascinated that we are now getting to be in a public space with the person
Right.
that we were only being able to text or FaceTime before. And I hope that we start to realize social media is great, but there's definitely a lot of human interaction that has been muted, because even physical touch is a way to communicate that our bodies thrive when it happens, that we were unaware of until the pandemic was just like, yeah, physical touch isn't allowed anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's so much that we've gotten to shift and change and can re-examine, and we have to. The hard part that we're in right now is to do that examination and be really intentional about how we're going to move forward, as opposed to go back to something else. And this might be religion talk too, but like I'm more interested in looking forward than looking back, right? Like what is, to use religious language, what is God doing in the world? What is God going to do in the world? And how are we a part of that? And I like thinking in questions like that has me looking ahead. And I think that's always been true for me. I've been someone that wants to go to something. I'm not running away from stuff or wanting to revert to something. I sort of like, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? What's the next thing? And there's a limit for how much you can do that. But I think I'm also getting a better sense for myself of, yeah, we kind of keep looking forward, recognizing that there's so much more that can and could be happening in the world, but I'm going to have to set some stuff aside to be able to move into whatever that new thing is. And so let's look at figuring out how we can set things aside. And I'll say, even this transition back, we got very like volunteer busy, because you can just be on back-to-back Zooms all day and all night long. And I love all that we're doing, but because I want to be out in the world with friends in real time in the same space together, it is going to mean saying like, I'm going to have to stop doing some of those like evening Zoom things so that I can set aside time to actually be physically around people and have real interaction. I will say one of the groups I'm a part of, I've only ever known online. We're having an in-person thing next weekend. I'm excited to learn how tall people actually are, because when you see folks like this, you have no clue. No one knows how tall I am right now. And I've guessed completely wrong about people's heights. So as we walk up and then I can like actually like size folks, I'm going to be probably very shocked that there are some much shorter people than I expected and some much taller people than I expected.
Yeah, a lot of people, I guess because of the way that I hold my camera when I take pictures, because I usually lean to get everyone in the picture, everyone assumes that I'm very short. And when they meet me for the first time, they're always blown away that I'm 6'1". So it's always interesting when I meet online friends for the first time, because they're just like, whoa, I thought you were going to be really short. I'm like, no. And they're like, are all your friends tall? I'm like, no, they're about my height or shorter. It's just I lean to take the pictures.
Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting for folks to figure that out. I'm also tall. I'm 6'3". And so this will be one of those, and which also means, I pointed out to my husband, like, if I think someone's tall, it means taller than me. Like I look at someone like, that person's taller than me. That's not most people, so I will notice it, and I like pay attention too. And during Pride in New York City this weekend, I was sort of doing that of like, 3 very tall people just walked by, and I meant that as in they're all taller than I am, and that was like my point of reference.
I love it. I think because you were kind of talking about how like, what does God want us to do going forward? something that I feel like I've really clung to as of last year, and I would say I was starting to learn a little bit as we went into 2020, but I used to feel like my calling from God was like my inner thoughts, my like what my body was telling me to do. And I started to realize that that almost was a misguiding for me personally, that I learned last year and a little bit into 2019 that it's almost like God put the messages in everyone else, and he wanted us to connect because God's message and God's like guidance for us is the people around us. And it's so interesting because there are so many conversations that I've had with people I would have never had a conversation with had this connection through Positive Talks not happened, Clubhouse not happened. But I started to just say things, and it was like the answers to their questions that they were having internally for themselves. And in the same, I also have things that I'm questioning and trying to figure out what direction I'm supposed to go. And just having conversations like this one and the ones that I've had with my friends, deeper conversations more than, hey, how's your day? But like deeper conversations, I've found answers through what my friends and other people that I've met have said. And I was like, you know what? Like, we're all here and we're all different because God put the answers in all of us to the questions, and everyone's got some, even when it comes to kids. Like,
Yep.
that's why I think it's so important to ask questions, because even my nephew, like, if I'm struggling, like there were weeks where I had really bad weeks, and I just talked to my nephew who's 4, and he would say something that literally just erased all that stress and worry, because he doesn't have all of that that I had on my shoulders at that time, and he saw like a clear picture of it, and I was just like, wow, sometimes you just have to say it, and like God will put the answer right in front of you. You just have to listen.
So you know what that is? That's like religion at its best. Like that is being around people that God has placed the thing that you need in them and to put you into a space together so that they can either reflect that back to you or say it to you or ask the question or prompt that for you. And I think whenever people talk about organized religion, like that's the dream of what it could be. It always falls short of that because again, humans are the foible and fallible. But I love the idea of the sense of like, I am put in a community so that people can challenge me or inspire me or give me what I need. And I'm there to give them what they need as well. And I think that's, when we think of like a faithful community, that's what that can look like. And in a lot of cases it does. I think part of it for us has always been like the focus of what is the church for? What is religion for? Is it to keep order, to keep the structure, or is it to let people come together so that they can have a common communal experience and have an experience with God, with the divine, and with one another, so that you can see this kind of beautiful community being created and developed and grow. So I hope there's more like that. I hope people do that and they find ways in order to make that happen, whether it's going to be a church service on a Sunday morning or a positive talk like this or some other way to get to be in that form of real, authentic community with each other.
Yeah, I think that kind of what we were talking about with like judgment. I think that if we can start doing some self-healing and then just being honest about our own life journey and our struggles and just sharing that with each other, I think that that would start to open the spaces, because I know that when I've been in a lot of spaces with religion, it's the judgment that people are afraid of. So they're afraid to share their struggles or something that they are thinking because they're afraid that they're going to be judged. And I think that if we can create more judgment-free spaces, if we could all work on ourselves, because I think a lot of times our judgment is based upon our judgment of ourselves, and we're putting it out and projecting it onto the people around us, which once someone feels judged, they start to close themselves off. And I think that that creates a really negative experience for anyone. So just creating more and more spaces where people feel less judged and that's everyone in the world. That's not just religious groups that make people feel that way. Like I when it comes to any type of community, like you can find someone that will make you feel like you don't belong there. And a lot of times that's just their trauma going out into the world. And I think that since I've been healing my own trauma, which I'm always doing it, it's a daily thing. It's not, I don't think I'll ever be done because new trauma comes. But I think that the more that I've done that, I've been able to see past other people's trauma, and their trauma doesn't impact me anymore, so that I can start helping and healing them. And if we all started doing more of that, I think that that would help everyone become closer as a community to where you can have that space where everyone does that.
Right, right. I think, yeah, I think I always feel like we've got this like experience with a really messy queer God who's all over the place and doing different things and manifests itself in three forms, but one God. And there's the LGBTQ community, the queer community, is also messy with a lot of different experiences. And I feel like those two messiness things kind of go together. And every time we try to put a structure or limits or boundaries around that, it stops being as like beautiful and magical and transformative. And it's, I think sometimes it's hard to live into that messiness. We want some like structure around us. I know I'm someone that wants a little bit of structure around me, to help me like organize and plan and what is it that I should do. And we do that for ourselves. But once we kind of, we can do this for ourselves, we can start put those structures on what other people's experiences are going to be like. I think then we start limiting what their experiences are, and we turn the institution into an idol, as opposed to, worshiping a big messy queer God that's Trinitarian and interacts with it so many different ways. And it cuts us off from the beauty of this community that, celebrates pride in millions of different ways and manifestations and expressions, and gets, and really gets that messiness. And we've got to get more comfortable. I've got to get more comfortable with how to lean into that messiness. And that's one of the things that I know I'm always working on for myself, both for religion and for the LGBTQ community. And I think if I can find a way to do that for myself, it might make me even better youth ministry person for young people, or a better advocate through my job at GLAAD.
Yeah. I had a friend he was part of the church, and he was also straight, and he had me read a book about order and chaos. And he talked about how much more comfortable he felt within order than he felt in chaos. And I discussed with him how I felt more comfortable in chaos than I did order, because order didn't match what I was. So I had to smash things.
So it wasn't your order either. Yeah. So I think that's part of it too.
I told him, I was like, I had to become comfortable more so with creating chaos so I could create an order that made me feel comfortable. Whereas he kind of walked into order, and he was very comfortable with what was passed down, because it was passed down to say that exactly who he was accepted. And I was just like, I think that all of us could, because technically nothing is order. I think that order is like a false thing to feel, because the pandemic proved to us that we thought that we knew how the world functioned, but a lot of us got flipped upside down. Like, I think that having one foot in chaos, one foot in order, and understanding the importance and beauty of both, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's the dry erase board that you talked about earlier. Like, you have to kind of erase that, and then you find a way to build that up so that you're answering those questions for you. And you can share those with others, and what you share can be instructive or helpful or inspirational for them to do, but people are going to take what you do and make it their own, or at least they should. My experience in the world is very unique, and that's true for all of us. So like, it's not that my experience is normative or the way that things are supposed to go or the way that it's supposed to be. It just was my experience, right? And so other people can look at that and they can learn from it. They can, even when I was writing this book, I sort of said up front, like, this is us trying to figure out how to do something that hadn't been done before. And so there's plenty of ways that we figured it out, and there's plenty of ways that we messed up. Hopefully you can look at my experience and you can do better than we did. And you can say, oh, I can avoid that error. Or you can see something that I think I did well and say, I know a way to make that even better. And I'm not I'm not going to be threatened by that. I think that's good because that's the continued growth and evolution that we have and how we do it. And so I put my contribution out in the world so that people can do something with it to make it their own, or to make it better, or to keep up with where society and our world and our culture are going. And I think that's what's going to be really important.
Yeah, it's important to create and then let it go, because once someone takes your work, like, they're going to interpret it through completely different perspectives than your own. And I mean, when it says, like, they say that it takes a community to raise a child, like, it does, because that child is going to learn from every individual within that community. The
Yep.
larger your community, the more diverse that community is, I think the better you will be as an individual, just because
Mhm.
learning tons of new things that you can choose tools. There might be someone that you learn nothing from, like, you're just like, you know what? Everything that you are doesn't really align with what I find as reality. And maybe 10 years from now, you'll take something from that experience, being like, huh, that little piece of knowledge I remember of them, that fits here now.
Or even in the moment, knowing that you're not somebody else is really helpful. Well, I don't know what I am, but I know I'm not like that. So like it's a process of elimination, right? Like, and I've had to do it, and if other folks do that as well, I think that's totally fine. They can see and learn from the experience, even if that experience is, that's not me. That's not what I would do. That's not how I'd react. I think even knowing that for ourselves is incredibly helpful.
Yeah. And I think that makes it so much easier to not classify a broad group of people by any, like, defined definition, because too often we're like, this community and this group of people, when you look at it, like, that community is made up of so much more than anything you could ever put on a list.
Yep. I will say I'm glad we get this all the time, because I work a lot with non-LGBTQ people, right? Reporters, people that, like, they want to be good allies and they don't want to mess up. And I get not wanting to mess up. So when we get questions like, what is the correct acronym? I was like, oh, there's no correct acronym. Or I see it behind you, what's the right version of the flag? It seems like it's changing all the time. It's like, it is changing all the time. And so and so even when people say, like, oh, can we have a copy of this presentation? We'll say things like, you know that in like a month this is going to be outdated, whatever we told you today, because things grow and change. And I get how frustrating that is. I think it's helpful. I'm glad I do a lot of, like, I have some, like, well, absolutely don't do these things, right? I can tell you what is wrong, but then, like, what's right, that's different, right? And it's going to be matching what's your context, what's the world like. With something like, some people use this, some people use this, some people use this. Well, which is right? Well, we're all different. And so if I tell you what I think is right, that's me as a white, cisgender, gay guy telling you this is the right thing, but that's probably going to privilege me more than anyone else. So, like, let's start to lean into, what are the values that you have? What is it you want to communicate? What is it you want to get across? Do you want to make sure that people have been historically marginalized get centered? Then find ways in your language that does that. Find ways in your imagery that does that. And even telling folks, and this is the hardest thing to tell folks, is that, like, maybe the rainbow flag is not always the right symbol for the community. And there's going to be other things that you can lean into that are going to be either more specific to whoever you're talking about or the story or the experience, or there are other ways to communicate that welcome and inclusion beyond this symbol of representation, even though the symbol of representation is a good, easy shorthand. So I'm always pushing people to, like, the more complex thing, when I know what they really just want, just tell me, like, use this one. And they'll say, well, can I use this one? Can I use this one that has the little, like, progress triangle chevrons on the end of it? And it's like, yeah, that's a good one to do. So I know, I see yours behind you. I have to share, I've shared this, I do this whole history of, like, oh, they used to have 8 colors. And do you know why they dropped pink and teal? They dropped it because it was too expensive. Like, there was no, like, grand meaning. It was just, pink was expensive, we can't get it. Teal was hard to get, so we'll just drop them. And then we have the progress flag. And I shared this year, I've seen a version of the progress flag's been added with the intersex symbol on it. With the gold background and the purple circle. And I said, it's gonna keep going from here. And so you're gonna have to keep revisiting this and checking in with the culture to say, what's going on? What of that do we want to make sure that we're incorporating for ourselves? And then, of course, how do I live that out and back that up in a real way? It's not just about the, like, putting up the rainbow. It's actually what our actions are. It's not just about getting the right acronym. It's actually knowing what each of those letters mean within the acronym and who's represented, and actually what hasn't been named in the acronym that we've come up with, and how to speak to their experience. So there's just such a whole, like, I'd rather have people think about those things, but I know the entry point for them is like flags, acronyms, pronouns, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I always tell people, like, when it comes to what I say is okay for me, be aware that that is only me as a person, because there are terms that, I mean, for me, this is the most updated flag I could find online. I tried to find the new one, but it's not anywhere on all the sites that I've ever bought from. But I've had conversations with people about the flag. Like, even on Clubhouse, like, it's very interesting because some people don't think broad enough to realize that these people are from all over the world. Like, what they're perceiving our community to be, like, you have to realize that their history comes with that. Like, we can't be so quick to judge each other within our own community, because someone who's living the trans experience in a rural area that has no connection to the LGBT community has a completely different definition of who they are and how they identify than someone who might have been brought up in a city where, as a young child, they were exposed to those terms. So I think that it's important for people, even within our own community, to ask more questions and be open to anyone's interpretation of what LGBTQIA stands for, what the flag symbol stands for, because some people.
Yeah, I just did a training this morning that was international, and and they want, like, oh, give us the terminology, give us the guidelines, and I said that here's what we have, but this is very American, and you are not, and so you're going to have to, like, translate it. You're going to have to change the cultural meaning of some of these things. You're going to have to ignore some stuff that we say because it makes sense for us, but not for anyone else. And so just recognizing, like, all those shortcomings and how much that applies is going to be so important.
Yeah, I've just from being on Instagram and having a following that has gone way out of the United States. Like, people have come to me with questions about how they should handle situations in countries that being LGBT is very dangerous, and that's just made me realize that it's my job, if people are looking at me, if I'm speaking on these topics, that I need to be open and aware that my interpretation is very Americanized. It's not something that can be used in other cultures currently. And, like, I'm too young and inexperienced in the journey of LGBT acceptance for me to even begin to give advice to someone who's very early on stages of their country learning how to accept LGBT. Because, I mean, even I have dove into history of the journey we've come on to be accepted here in the United States. And that's only a small piece of learning their culture, because each country is different. And, like, I'm like, here's some great references of what we've done in the United States. Use pieces of all of that to try to get you something going on.
If it's helpful, use this, but I will say also, the odd thing that we're in right now, and I recognize this through GLAAD, is sort of like, and this is colonialism, and we can have a whole conversation about that, but everyone views and sees what happens in the United States. Like, it's this big, like, export. And so one of the things I've recognized is that even, like, moments of progress in the United States sometimes creates backlash overseas, right? And there's this overarching, what's the relation, what's happening here? Or, oh, that's just a Western phenomenon, ignoring those queer cultures that have always existed within countries and cultures and communities. And so that's always been one thing that I've always been very cognizant of, is that it's global, it's a different thing, and the United States is such a global superpower that, like, what happens here does have impact. And I do a lot of work with international LGBTQ organizations, and so always kind of being aware of that and having to be in a very humble posture of, I want you to drive what your strategy is, because you know your country best and what you're going to do. And hopefully what happens here doesn't have negative impact, or if it does, can I help you with what's the negative impact that's coming from my own country, because that's what I kind of have responsibility for, more so than what's going on in a different country. Even as I'm trying to, like, help and support groups that are there, and so we always offer up what are the resources, and other folks are going to do what they're going to do with it and make it work best for them in their country, culture, situation, and not have to be dictated by what works for, me here in the United States, in New York, in a large LGBTQ organization, or even a little one like the Naming Project, which is, comparing the Naming Project and GLAAD are such different things. Like Naming Project, all volunteer, just enough money to run our camp, like hustling to fundraise just to get just enough. GLAAD, a much bigger, more resource staffed organization, can be more, so like the two of them are kind of me operating sort of night and day at the same time. And sometimes it's cool because they get to sort of like cross over. So I talk about these things at the same time. And I love that they do reinforce each other. And that's been knowing that these different aspects and parts of my life really do knit together vocationally to tell me who I am and, what I'm doing in the world.
Yeah. I love how you kind of talked about like the United States doing something in it, impacting other nations, as well as like, I like to point out to people, because I did move back to rural America after living in big cities, is what happens in the LGBT community in big cities impacts the ones in the rural areas that don't have the same protections.
Yeah.
I always try to make people, like, I've had that conversation with people where I'm like, be careful, because you're like, when you say you don't care what the rednecks of the rural America think, you will when you realize that you're causing them to hate the LGBT community in a way that's going to be dangerous to members that don't have a community. And like, I always tell people, like, I was very thankful, like Lynchburg, Virginia had their first Pride in 2019. I thought that was amazing that such a red place would have a Pride, and that's important. And people from Richmond, from DC came down to that. People from Stanton, which in the Shenandoah Valley here in Virginia, had been doing it for a couple more years than Lynchburg had. Like, all of these spaces, I think it's important for us, because a lot of LGBT people leave those spaces to feel safe. But it's important to realize we're born back into those spaces, because LGBT people aren't born from their community. They're born in the world of heterosexual people. So it's important for people to realize, and when you travel, if you're driving, you don't want to break down on the road where LGBT is hated and you've got your Pride stickers all over your car and you're wearing your rainbow stuff. Like, that type of stuff should be thought of, because those places need to be educated. And that's one of the main things that held me in Virginia, because I came back a more confident, educated, queer person. And I was just like, you know what? Like, they can't silence me, and I am educated to answer their questions. When it comes to debate, I do have an argument that will hold up against their closed-minded arguments. And I think that more of that needs to happen, because, I mean, I've probably gone over probably more than 30 churches now here in Virginia and North Carolina, and just gave myself up to them. And I was like, I will tell you my story. You can ask any question and I will give my best answer or give you a reference. And that has opened my eyes to so many different things, just because I threw myself into the space that I saw the issue and the divide. And I was just like, I'm going to give myself to them and educate them, because that's where I've found the biggest disconnect is there's no educating back and forth. And therefore,
and when we this is hard, and I struggle with this personally. I'm from a tiny hometown, and when we leave a vacuum, and what else fills that when we're gone? No one else is saying, this is me, this is what my experience is, this is what life is, as a gay man is like, because we flee and go to the bigger city. And again, and I did this too, right? Now I'm living in, I joke, I grew up in the woods with my nearest neighbors 5 miles down the road, no telephone until I was a junior in high school, and Canadian television only. And I struggle of like, if or how or when I want to go back and visit, go to things like school reunions, stuff like that, and wanting to be myself, and both fantasizing what that experience will be like and kind of fearing it at the same time too. And that's probably for me one of the biggest last hurdles to think about as well, and how to do that, which I think is going to be really, really hard. And so I'm kind of gearing myself up for that. My parents are great. My home is great. My home congregation was great. My high school experience wasn't, and that's where I think all my hangups are. And I'm also not giving them any opportunity to grow or change or evolve, and I sort of have them stuck back at that like high school experience where I am too. So that's been one of my things I've been working on, is how to like try to get over that and then go back and be as authentically, and probably again be surprised that I have more allies than I thought I did, or that I've got better, sassier comebacks than I ever did in high school, and that I can just deploy them when I'm there. So we'll see which one of those happens. Maybe both.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I see that we've gone quite over our hour conversation, but I felt like the conversation was just flowing really nicely. But I just want to say thank you so much for jumping on this live and doing this. I know that you're very busy, but I absolutely love what you are doing. I love that there's someone out there trying to help people stay connected to their religious beliefs and not feel like there has to be an either or. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think that the organizations that you're a part of, I've looked into those, and I think that they're amazing. I've done a lot of stuff with the GLAD Foundation as well, so I think that they're really amazing. Danny kind of got me into some of the like stuff that's going on in the background, which it's amazing how much work goes on in the background of those things to kind of produce what the public sees for the events and guests speaking and all of that.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. I love having conversations like this, and I hope it was fun for me. I hope it was fun for you, and I hope it was fun for the folks that are listening in on this. I don't do a lot of Instagram lives, so this is like a good practice for me.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I will let you go so you can have a good rest of the evening, and I will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Yep. Bye.
Bye.